Hi, welcome to the More Business Podcast. My name is Raj Khera, and my mission is to help 250 entrepreneurs become millionaires within 5 years of starting their business. And today I have as a guest, Ashlee Berghoff. Ashlee has a virtual assistant company. Ashlee, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Raj. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, so could maybe just share in a minute a little bit about your background.
Yeah. So the work I do today is process improvement consulting and virtual assistant recruiting. But as with most of us, it was not a straight line from childhood to that.
Yeah,
I spent some
never
time.
is.
No.
It never is.
I studied English in college, spent some time in international nonprofit, in staffing, in project management, went back to school for business. And through that whole process, fell in love with the operations side of things, with project management, realized that not everyone organizes their room for fun when they're 12 years old, and that maybe I could really lean into that nerdiness and get paid for it. So I started my business about 5 years ago and have been figuring things out ever since. I don't know that I'd ever go back now that I've gotten a taste of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, once you get bitten by the bug, it's really hard to go back. There are days that you think, why did I ever start this? But then, like in the long run, you've been doing it for a while. I know I've been doing it for a while too. It's very hard to go back. And I like what you said about creating these organizational systems, because sometimes people call them hacks. I sometimes call them like work hacks, but they're really systems, they're really processes, and they're designed to improve your productivity. And that's going to be the focus of today's conversation. And I like the fact that you've got a virtual assistant company, because quite often an entrepreneur or even growing businesses can take advantage of having virtual assistants without needing to worry about adding somebody to payroll, so they could use them as consultants. And the beauty of the virtual part of it is, ever since COVID, people really embraced working from home. You're working from home, I'm working from home. I love meeting people in person, but I also like not having to commute half an hour to an hour each way.
Yes,
So,
especially in the DC area.
yeah. So let's get into a couple of these systems. Entrepreneurs oftentimes they really go the do-it-yourself route in many cases. And sometimes they're still doing everything, just from like bookkeeping all the way to, setting up their social media posts and all kinds of activities. So what are some of the systems, the processes that startups or small businesses need, and why do they even need them?
Yeah. So I'll start with that second question, why we need them. A lot of times, I think when we think of systems and processes, we think of big process and procedure manuals and maps and bureaucracy, right? We've seen systems gone bad. And so it can be easy to not want to deal with that. When we're an entrepreneur, we were often leaving a business to get away from all of that. But the way I like to define systems as the way we do things and the things that decide what actually happens versus what we want to have happen, right? So, a lot of us want to spend more time on our creative work or get something done in a certain period of time or things like that. But without the systems to support us, often those things don't actually happen, because the systems that run our lives in the day-to-day are what's deciding what actually happens. So that's why when we're intentional about how we do what we do, we can go in the direction that we are intending to, right? In terms of what systems are most important to start with, I usually recommend two for most entrepreneurs. One being a really strong system for how they're managing their time and their planning. Because no matter what business you are, what stage, all of that, how you spend your time is the most important thing, right? And so getting to a point where you wake up every morning, you have a clear list of what you're working on that day. It's actually achievable. It's moving you in the direction you want to go. You have a chance to feel like you're winning. Like, all of that is really important when you don't have any natural constraints of a boss telling you what to focus on or things like that, right? So that's always the first one. And then for many entrepreneurs, especially if they're in any kind of service business, but even for product businesses, the customer experience is the next big one.
Customer experience is big. Very big. Yeah. In fact, I remember when I was building my companies, the first person I hired, a lot of people think, oh, I need to hire a salesperson to bring in more money and so on. It's actually, for me, it's been someone to manage customers. It's been the customer experience to make sure, because that once customers are happy, they start spreading the word about you. And these days they'll post online reviews, which then, you know, it's got a compounding effect. So let's dive into some of these systems a little bit more. I like the one about self-planning because that's pretty important. I personally try to put things on my calendar. In fact, I've got color codes so that I've got, you know, green for stuff that's a meeting that nobody can block time off on my calendar for, but it's just me and it's work time, and I've scheduled specific activities. I also use tools like Trello, which is a free online Kanban board system. Very convenient, nice way to check off things. And personally, I like to actually write stuff down. I don't know, I'm old school. I like physically writing something on a sheet of paper. So I've got a little to-do list, and then I love scratching it off.
Oh, 100%.
You know, there's something about that kinesthetic mental thing when you actually scratch something off. And I don't mean like put down stuff that's just trivial on your to-do list just so that you have something to scratch off. But I mean something that's like, okay, today I felt good because I had a good day. I wrote a blog. I posted, you know, 1 week's worth, or scheduled 1 week's worth of social media posts. You know, I got my bookkeeping done for the month, whatever it has to be. So what kind of systems or ways to manage your time do you recommend?
Yeah. I mean, everything you mentioned is a really good set of things, and everyone's so different, right, in terms of what's most helpful. But one of the very, very first things I recommend for any entrepreneur, which is something that we often didn't need as much if we came from a corporate background, is separating your to-do list from your ideas list.
That's
right?
a good one.
A lot of times when I sit down with someone who's really overwhelmed, what I find is that they listen to a podcast, they listen to a webinar, they go to a training, every idea that they come up with in the shower, all of it lands on their to-do list, right? Oh, I could do that. Yep. Put it on the to-do list. And then they start it that afternoon, right? And so then they end up with just a massive pile of good ideas it's impossible to get all of that done. And so they never get the chance to feel like they're winning. And then you start losing faith in yourself and your ability to finish projects, and it spins, right? So the first thing we do is we really tightly protect that to-do list. A small number of projects, whether time bound or not. For some, we recommend setting aside, 6 weeks for 4 to 10 projects. That's it. And everything else goes on the ideas list. For others, it might be you have 3 or 4 slots for big projects and you can't add a new project until something else clears out of space, whatever that looks like. But having a very, very tightly controlled to-do list and a space to honor and hold all of the ideas that every entrepreneur has on a daily basis. It's very helpful.
I agree with that. I think one of the things I've seen with almost every entrepreneur is this never-ending idea list, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And then what happens is the idea list really becomes an idea graveyard list.
Yeah, right.
And you just have all these things on there, and like, oh my gosh, I put this down on my list 7 months ago, and I just haven't gotten to it because I'm working on other things. And I think it's important to also differentiate working in your business versus working on your business. And so, in your business, meaning you're actually servicing clients, you're doing the stuff that your business does, versus on your business means, you're figuring out how to develop your brand and get your word out and all that kind of stuff to really grow your company. So those are really good tips. Do you just put it on a spreadsheet, or do you have some tools that you recommend to people?
Yeah. So the way I do it is I have just a small list that is my sprint list, right, of the main projects I'm working on. I used to have it bound by 6 weeks. Now, just with the new season of life I'm in, I have the 3 slots instead. So 3 main projects. Once those projects are done, that creates space for a new one. So that's really easy. I just have that, and Notion is what I use for that.
Is it called Notion?
Notion. Oh yeah, Notion is fun. It is, how would I call it? It's kind of an organizational playground. It's a little bit more of a blank slate than a lot of the other tools, which means you can build things exactly as you want. The risk always with it is you have to be very intentional about how you build it, or else things get lost, because you just end up with pages and pages in all these different places, and they're nested inside of each other and you can't find anything. But it's really fun because you can do databases and things like that. So I use it for content planning, all of my, my content library, my editorial calendar, my database of trainings, all of it's there. And this list. Then I use a tool that I rarely recommend called Jira, because it's not easy to learn. But one of the things I like about it is then I can plan out my week. So just like you put things in your calendar, I allocate a certain amount of time to tasks for the coming week, right? So I'll say, okay, on Wednesday, I can spend 2 hours on this. Thursday, I'm going to spend an hour on that. And it'll tell me when I'm out of time. So it kind of gives me that flexibility around when things happen. But it still ties my to-do list to my actual capacity. So that's how I do that. And then just like you, I write it down every day because I like to scratch things off.
Yeah, I know there's something about it's funny. I posted something on LinkedIn a while back about just like the joy I get of actually like physically taking my pen and scratching something off at the end of the day. And so many people commented on it because like it resonated. A lot of us seem to like to do that as opposed to just having something on your phone or your to-do list on your computer. In fact, I struggle with even using the sticky pad utility on my Mac because I actually like physical sticky notes, that I can just write them down, take them, done that one, toss it out, so the little things like that are pretty good. For Jira, so I've used Jira a lot too. Jira is a technical tool. I think it started, for software developers, and my companies have all been software related. And so how do you use that? And like, if you're not a software developer, I'm really curious to know how you find that, because there's a learning curve with Jira.
It just doesn't have a very pretty interface compared to some of the other tools, right? So I use an add-on called Tempo Planner. So that gives me that board where I can allocate time, and it'll tell me you have 5 hours of time available on this day. You have 3 hours of calls. You've allocated 2 hours worth of work. You can't do anything else on that day. So it gives me that once a week dash of disappointment about being finite, and then I can actually win the whole week because it's realistic. So that's what I use. Jennifer, who's on my team, actually uses more of a built-in function within Jira, which is the sprint board, which is a little hard to explain when someone's never seen it before. But essentially the idea is that in Jira, you can have a category of tasks under a project name, and then you can have everything that's on your radar for a client, say, or a type of work. But then there's a sprint section you can add above that list just for that week or that 2 weeks, whatever period of time you want. And you can move tasks into that shorter list. So that can be really helpful, especially for something like marketing, say, where you have a bunch of different things going on, a number of things on your radar, but there are only 2 things you're working on that week. You can kind of pull them out. So that's how she uses it. To have that.
For anybody listening who's thinking about, okay, sprint, well, because that's actually a term very widely used in the software development industry to describe, hey, we're going to just focus on these new developments or these bug fixes for the next 2 weeks. That's a sprint, and we're just going to nail all these things down. And here's the 10 bug fixes we're working on, and they get assigned. And people put in information about, okay, here's what I did. Here's now it's fixed. I've tested it and all that. And then it goes to QA, quality assurance for testing, and so on. So I think I like that idea because you can do sprints really in any kind of business to really time bound what you've got. One of the questions then would stem here is, how do you know what actually needs to be systematized and what can stay as is? And by stay as is, sometimes things are okay being a little bit loosey-goosey, So, how do you know what you actually should create a system for?
So the way I think about it is, if we go back to this concept that systems decide what happens, right? Then we can just look at the outcomes, right? And say, okay, do I like the outcomes that the way I'm doing things is bringing about in my life and my business? If the answer is yes, your system is working as you would like, even if it's not super structured, even if there's a little bit of room for things to flow a little more organically, right? But on the flip side, if the outcomes aren't what you like, it's time to look at the system and think about, okay, what is it about the way I'm doing things that is leading to this outcome I don't like? And is there a way I can start to do things differently and maybe put a little bit more structure around it? So for a lot of people, it looks like, hey, a new client or a new customer is bad news because I do not have the space for this person. That's a huge sign, right? That it's time to start streamlining, leveraging, systematizing things, or, consistently not hitting the goals that you set for yourself, in say a marketing channel, or, you need to be more consistent about showing up in a certain way to get the results you want from your marketing channel. If you're not doing that regularly, it's time to look at what's your system for creating content, for publishing, for whatever it looks like that you're wanting to do. So yeah, it can be helpful to just think about, all right, where are things not flowing the way I want? If you kind of think about the same way as our houses, we don't think about our electrical systems or our plumbing systems until they break. And then we go digging for the source of that problem and seek to fix it in the system, right? It's the exact same in a business.
I'm reminded of systems don't need to be complex. In many cases, they can be really, really simple. I'm reminded of a situation where one of my CEO friends runs a distribution company. And so clients would call him because when he started his business, he's very customer focused. He'd give out a cell phone number. Anybody could reach him at any time. So people would call him up and say, hey, do you know the status of my order? When do you think it'll be shipping? And so he goes, well, let me find out and I'll get back to you. And what he would do is after he got off the phone, he would call his assistant, Kathy. Kathy would go look it up, tell him, and then he would call the client back. And it was taking so much time because he was getting calls all the time. He wanted to be really responsive to his customers and they loved it. But he was scratching his head thinking, gosh, I'm spending literally hours a week on the phone with these things that Kathy can handle. So he made one really small tweak we recommended and just said, hey, when they call, just say the following words. What did Kathy say? And that's it. That was the only change. So when he started doing that, it did multiple things. It still meant, hey, I'm being responsive to you. But it trained his customers to call his assistant first. Suddenly his phone calls stopped, like coming in all hours. He had so much more time for his own productivity, and he was actually using his assistant the way he should be. And so and he still provided great service to people. So when people think about systematizing their businesses, sometimes it really is as simple as a quick change in the way you phrase a response to a customer.
Or the order of the way you do things. It can be that simple, and being able to think about it from a systems perspective also can take it out of this angsty space, right? For him of like, if I change this, I'm not going to be showing up for my clients the way that I want, and they're going to be frustrated, and I'm going to, lose this personalized experience and whatever. And instead just stepping back and looking at the system and saying, hey, this is what they need. I'm going to Kathy. Maybe they can just do that and still get exactly what they need, actually more quickly than coming through me, And so being able to step back, it kind of takes that personal edge off of it enough to say, oh, okay, I can just tweak the system right here.
And there's another reason I've found systems to be just incredibly important, even if you're a one-person business. And that is, what you want to do is build your business to sell it. And it took me a while to get my head around this. A lot of times, like when you start a company, you want the independence, you want to just run it. You're not necessarily thinking about selling it. Back in the back of your head, you're probably thinking, okay, when I reach, and it's kind of funny, when I reach a birthday that ends in a 0, which is actually the most common thing people think of, when I turn 40, 50, 60, whatever it is, I'm going to sell my company. And you'd be surprised, this is very common. And so when you reach that, you're thinking, all right, well, if I'm at a birthday that's ending in a 7 or 8 or a 9, and I'm thinking I'm going to sell it, and then when it ends in a 0, it might be a little late. You really got to build your processes ahead of time. So what I advise people is build your company to sell it, because when you do that, everything you do, the entire lens of every action, like your bookkeeping, your marketing, your sales processes, your inventory control, if you have that as part of your business, all revolves around creating some sort of systems, because when you sell your company, people buy the systems that you've got in place. They're not going to, like, if you got too much loosey-goosey stuff going on, they're not going to be able to get their head around, well, where the skeletons are. Whereas if you have processes in place and say, this is how we do X, this is how we do Y, they've got a little bit more assurance. And just by that process, the valuation of your company increases. At least that's what I've noticed. So that's another big thing to add. What kind of systems have you put in place for your business? Some examples of what you've done, and maybe some things that you've done for your clients.
Yeah. So I know we've talked a little bit about the customer experience. So for us, that's always the first one that we look at and make sure is strong. As a service provider, we want to make sure we're providing an amazing experience that's consistent, that's leverageable, that we're able to bring in a lot of extra clients without everything breaking, right? So that's always the first one we start with. Another one often with our clients that we're looking at, if that's good, is how things are happening internally within the team, how the baton is being passed. So to give you an example of one of my favorite clients this past year, they're a marketing company they have lots of campaigns running in a lot of different directions, events and a community and a forum. And so they have this whole team, and there's a lot of publishing going on and a lot of little pieces, right, to think about. And what they found is as they were growing, they had a bigger and bigger and bigger team, and he was great at finding great people. But the way they described it is they were just kind of passing a ball of overwhelm from one person to the next, right? So he was overwhelmed, so he'd hire someone else and toss the ball to them, and then they'd get overwhelmed, and they'd pass it back and forth with this other person. And they were spending a lot of time trying to figure out what was even happening, right? What's the status of this, and what's going on over here? And there was one person who her entire job was like shepherding a task from the writer to the editor to the publisher, right? She was taking it from one person and handing it to the next person. And so what we looked at with their process was, how can we identify what's even happening here? Because you're just by sheer force of will keeping this thing alive, but you're exhausted. What's actually happening, and how can we train the team to just pass the baton from one person to the next, right? And they know who it goes to next, and that person knows who it goes to after that. And so we did a lot of documentation around that, so that they could do that. So especially as like small teams start growing, that is a big piece, is what is the connecting work happening from one team member to the next?
Yeah, as you grow and create different departments, and you've got a marketing department, and maybe a sales department, all that, those kind of connectors are really, really critical. And building processes and systems in place to keep all that in check. That's actually what people buy. You know, like if you're going to sell your company, they're going to buy that entire setup and system, because they know that what you're doing is you're de-risking your company. It's a lot less a risk for them to come in and continue operations as they are. So yeah, a lot of this revolves around setting up these processes for, what are some of the ways that you measure improvement, productivity improvement? Is there some sort of metric you can say, yep, we added this process and now we're more efficient? Is there, do you have any benchmarks on how people can measure that?
Yeah. It's been interesting because it depends on the type of process and the type of team. So if I'm working with a solopreneur, a lot of the improvement for them is intangible in terms of how they feel. Because a lot of times they're coming in, I haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. I'm constantly worried about what I'm missing. I'm starting to miss deadlines with my clients. I can't take on anyone else. What am I going to do? And just getting to a point where they start to see a future of being able to step away from the business, being able to feel very confident that they're not dropping the ball at any point, right? That's often kind of the biggest sign for us that they're not drowning anymore. But for them, from a tangible metric standpoint, it usually looks like them logging their time and realizing that the balance of their time has shifted away from putting out fires towards working on their business, right? Wow, I actually have 4 hours every Friday afternoon I've blocked off to do this, and it actually happens. This is incredible, right? For larger teams, it often looks like just your capacity, your client capacity is a big one. Can you take on another client or not, right? A lot of times when they come in, they can't. How much time are you spending going back and forth with that client about things later on in the process that we could just solve that problem earlier in the process where you're not having to spend all that time later. So that will be measured by the ability to grow the business with the same size team they already had. Is the big one.
So you're really figuring out ways to do more with what you have, in some cases, maybe even more with less, figuring out whether they're tools and other, just software packages or something that can actually improve your productivity. I've found that a lot of times, it's interesting. A lot of times when people start a company, they're very concerned about the cost, the expenses. And what happens is that there's a confusion between what's an expense versus what's an investment.
Right.
And sometimes they just merge the two together, that, oh, this is going to cost me something, and they won't spend $200, $500 a month on whatever it could be. It could be hiring a virtual assistant. It could be, $1,000 a month for like other software that will really help encapsulate everything. And suddenly all the operations are, really streamlined. And when you look at that in terms of a cost comparison to hiring a person, that can be really a big price difference. So it's sometimes just cheaper to put those types of processes in place. How do you know, let me ask you this one. So now, how do you know when you've outgrown one system and you need a new system? So you've put a process in place, it's worked for you so far. But how do you know when you got to update that?
Yeah, that's where things get kind of tricky, because you don't want to be behind the 8 ball and wait till things start breaking, right? To be like, oh, okay, this isn't working anymore. So it's always kind of a question of, how do we see it coming? Okay, we've started outgrowing this. We're starting to feel, and I think usually it'll happen in the way people are feeling about a process. And also, if it's your customer experience, for instance, the way your sales team is thinking. So in my past corporate job, we saw this happen all the time, and it drove my manager nuts, because she was in charge of staffing. When our team started hitting capacity, we started having everyone on a project, everyone's pretty busy. They consciously or unconsciously would start pushing the brakes or just laying off the gas in their sales, right? And be like, well, I don't have the staff to fulfill this, so I'm just not going to pursue that client as hard. And she'd always try to sit them down and be like, no, win the work. We'll figure it out. We can bring in more people, right? But you can start noticing that a little bit, like even before something starts breaking, right? People will start to ease back of bringing more people through a process, or you start thinking or saying out loud, like, oh, I don't think we have room for a whole lot more, that many more customers coming through, or, oh, what if we do this campaign and it works really, really well? Like, what happens to everything? If you're starting to think about those questions, then it's time that it might be, we might need to start expanding our capacity, whether that's changing the system itself or bringing in more people, or finding areas that used to be customized and making them a little more automated, right? So it might be that you do some kind of onboarding call with all of your clients individually for a while. You might start noticing, like, this is filling up my calendar. This is getting annoying. Time to start doing a group call once a week and everyone comes on, or something like that, where often it'll kind of happen in one of the kind of weaker zone points of the system where you start to notice some stress. And then it's good to look at the whole thing instead of just that one piece.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about just noticing what's happening in your sales department, as well as your customer success department, because the moment you're getting hints of an unhappy customer, that's when, that's like alarm bells should be going off left and right. I know that the moment you've got an unhappy customer, look, every now and then everybody gets a customer that might just be a little handful to deal with. So you have to figure out, like, is that what you're dealing with, or is it something inside your team? Is it a process? Is it a person in your team? Maybe that could also be the case. Or is it just a process that you've got set up that maybe if you refined a little bit, you could put a little magnifying glass on it and then dive in deeper. There's one thing that I learned from one of my former CEO. I used to be part of a big coaching group, and another gentleman in there used something he called an imagination day. And what he would do is, during the week, he would go to a local nice hotel that has a nice lounge and cafe, and he would just park himself there with his notepad, his computer, turn off his phone so that he could not get any phone calls. Everybody knew he was going to be out for about 2 to 3 hours that morning. And he would just sit, enjoy his breakfast, coffee, and everything. And he would just think, and he would dream, and he would imagine what he wanted his growth to look like. Again, working on your business as opposed to in your business. And he did this about once a quarter, and he found that that was so refreshing because it got him the opportunity to, as you put, like your idea list versus your to-do list, he actually got a chance to look at those ideas and say, this one actually should be a priority because I think if we implement it this way, it will generate an additional 5% revenue. And this one could cut our costs. And so then he'd retweak that list all the time, as opposed to just being reactive.
Yes.
And just saying, oh yeah, we got a client, we got to go do this, we got to do that. Oh, let's get everything, and then all you're doing is just spinning your cycles. So that's important too. And there's another thing that I'm reminded of. It's a quote that I can't remember where I heard it, but the first time it resonated so well with me is, you have a business when you can go on vacation and you come back and you still have a business.
Yep.
And the only way to do that is to have processes in place, right?
Yes.
And I think the documentation that you're talking about is also effectively a training manual, so that when you start hiring people, even if you're a single entrepreneur right now, or if you've got a small team, as you create these processes, it basically is a document that people who you bring on can follow to say, this is how we do things here.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
Ashlee, what other tips do you have that you could share with any of our listeners here today?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that was most important and hardest for me to learn, because I started my business for freedom. I started it for autonomy. I wanted to be able to flex my working hours around the lifestyle I needed at various phases in my life, was that entrepreneurial freedom is not automatic, but it is possible at any phase in the business. I kind of fell into the common trap I hear a lot with my clients too, which is that, oh, once I hit six figures or 7 figures or this revenue goal, or once I get this offer out, or once this event is over, then things will calm down. I just need to get through X. But the problem is behind X is another X and another one after that, right? And we, without even realizing it, get used to operating at a certain pace, and we'll always fill that space. So even with systems, even with processes, I always talk to people about this. If we increase your efficiency of the work you're already doing by 20%, what we want to make sure you don't do is immediately add 25% more work to your plate. Because that can happen. And then you end up every bit as underwater as you were before, right? Because there's this kind of belief that we can have sometimes of like, oh, if I just push a little bit harder, I will actually get to the other side. I will actually get to the bottom of this barrel. I will get it all done. And so it's helpful just from a mindset perspective, as you're going through and building systems, to recognize, like, I can have entrepreneurial freedom in this phase of my business that I'm in right now. But that will not just happen at any point in my business. It has to be something that I'm very consciously building, using my systems, but not expecting my systems to just magically make me not work as much.
Right. Yeah. It's like the Russian doll. Every time you open one, there's like still more even behind it. And to your point about adding overhead, that happens when you add systems, because a lot of times entrepreneurs are like, oh, it's just so much faster if I just did it, and then you don't take the time to either build a system or a process in place to make sure that, okay, this is a replicable thing. This is how we handle onboarding of a new client. This is how we provide training to a new client. This is how we set client expectations prior to the sale. These are all processes that you want to have in place. And so that does add overhead, but sometimes you need a little bit of that overhead, just to be able to grow the company, because it allows you to scale. You can't do everything yourself. You need team members to really scale. But at the same time, you have to be mindful that you're not just creating a pile of overhead, that's all you end up doing.
Right.
Yeah, very true. Well, Ashlee, how can people who are listening find you?
Yes. Yeah. So my business is A Squared Online. So we're at asquaredonline.com. That's a great way to find out more about what we're up to. I have, if the stuff we've talked about time has been interesting in any way, I have a free training there about how I manage my time and how that's been helpful as an entrepreneur. So that's right there on the homepage. And I also hang out on LinkedIn.
Very good. So yeah, just type in Ashlee Berghoff on LinkedIn, and you'll be able to get to her. And I like the free training about how you manage your time. Honestly, that is one of the biggest challenges that most entrepreneurs have is, what is the best use of my time today? In fact, that's like the biggest question you should be asking yourself every morning. What is the best use of my time today? And if it's just, oh gosh, this list.
Yeah, it's just too much.
List. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Ashlee. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope our listeners got some value out of understanding ways to improve their business and grow through adding processes, systems, and even using some tools to help streamline their operations. Thank you very much for joining us today.